The palace smelled of smoke, sweat, and hot oil. In the heart of Samarkand, under the burning sun of Central Asia, a ruler sat on his golden throne. His name was Sultan Iskander, a warlord feared from the deserts of Persia to the mountains of modern-day Uzbekistan. He was not born noble. He earned power through blood, fire, and a terrifying weapon, a giant cauldron of boiling oil. Sultan Iskander ruled in the late 14th century, shortly after the time of Timur the Lame. Better known as Tamerlane, Iskander had seen what fear could do to people, and he knew how to use it. His soldiers carried curved blades, but they didn't always need them. Just the mention of the Sultan's oil pot could make cities surrender without a fight. The cauldron was enormous, built of thick bronze, and stood over a roaring fire. It wasn't hidden. It was placed in the open courtyard, where all could see. Smoke curled into the sky. The smell of scorched flesh lingered for days. This was no secret execution. It was a warning. Once, a rival noble named Yusuf refused to bow to Sultan Iskander. Yusuf believed his city was strong. He sent a letter mocking the Sultan's threats. He didn't believe a man could be that cruel. He was wrong. Sultan Iskander sent no army. Instead, he invited Yusuf to Samarkand for peace talks. Yusuf, proud and foolish, accepted. He arrived in fine clothes, with his sons and advisors. A feast was prepared with sweet rice, lamb, and fruit wine. But just as the musicians began to play, the Sultan clapped his hands. The guards surrounded Yusuf. His sons were dragged to the courtyard. The giant pot was already boiling. Flames licked its sides. One by one, Yusuf's sons were thrown in, their screams rising above the drums. The crowd was silent. Some turned away. Others watched, frozen. Yusuf was made to watch it all. Then the Sultan whispered in his ear, "This is what defiance brings." To hear what happened next, make sure to subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you don't miss the rest of this brutal tale. Yusuf fell to his knees, his fine robes now stained with sweat and ash. His hands trembled as he stared at the bubbling pot where his sons had just been thrown. The heat from the flames reached his face, but he didn't move. He couldn't. Sultan Iskander watched him with calm eyes, sipping wine as if nothing had happened. The Sultan didn't kill Yusuf today. No, he let him live, but not out of mercy. He sent him back to his city, alone, broken, carrying the story of what he had seen. It was not just a punishment. It was a message written in blood and fire. Betray me, and I will not only end your life, I will destroy everything you love first. Word of the boiling pot spread faster than any army. Poets, traders, and beggars carried the tale across the Silk Road. Even Persian historians, like Sharaf ad-Din al-Yazdi, recorded stories of such punishments in their chronicles. Some called it justice, others called it madness, but no one denied his power. Sultan Iskander's methods were not just cruelty for cruelty's sake in those days. Fear was a weapon as sharp as any sword. When the Sultan's army approached a city, the people inside had a choice: open the gates or face the cauldron. Many surrendered before the first arrow was fired. His enemies hated him, but his people obeyed. They believed he was chosen by fate, perhaps even protected by God. In truth, Iskander was no holy man. He rarely entered a mosque. He trusted fire more than faith. Still, he knew how to hold power. He built roads, repaired canals, and kept order in the streets. Merchants paid their taxes without question. Even the wildest bandits avoided his lands. One winter, a group of rebels attacked a tax caravan near the mountains. They stole gold, killed the guards, and thought they had escaped. They were wrong again. Within a week, the rebels were caught. Their leader, a tall man with long hair and a sharp tongue, was brought to the palace. The Sultan ordered no trial, no talk. He ordered the pot prepared, but this time, he made it public. Crowds filled the square. Women, children, old men, all gathered to see. The rebel was stripped, tied, and raised above the pot on a wooden beam. His screams echoed across the city as the heat rose, and once again, the The Sultan watched, silent, unmoved, unblinking. The rebel's body twisted above the boiling oil, skin blistering before it even touched the surface. The people watched in horror, yet none dared to speak. Some wept quietly. Others held their children close, whispering prayers. But Sultan Iskander sat still, his face as hard as stone. When the body finally dropped into the pot, the fire crackled louder, as if fed by the screams. The guards pulled the lid over the cauldron, sealing in the horror. And then, without a word, the Sultan stood up and left the square. His message was sent. There was nothing more to say. Behind him, the crowd slowly began to disperse. No one asked questions. No one dared. But not everyone was. Silent in the city's poorer quarters, whispers started to grow. People spoke in low voices, behind closed doors, of the Sultan's madness. They spoke of the fear that now ruled their lives, not just of war, but of being seen, noticed, or suspected by the Sultan's men. It was said that one could be boiled not only for rebellion, but for suspicion. A merchant who once laughed loudly at a court joke disappeared. A palace cook was thrown in the pot after a bad meal. True or not, such stories spread like wildfire. One woman, Mariam, lost her husband after he argued with a tax officer. Days later, soldiers came to their home. Her husband was taken. She waited all night at the palace gates, crying, begging to see him. She never did. Instead, a guard handed her a pouch of coins. Blood money, they called it. Inside, there was a ring, the one her husband always wore. Even those close to the Sultan began to fear him. His advisors spoke carefully. Avoiding any hint of disagreement, they bowed lower, praised him louder, and watched their own backs. Iskander trusted no one, not even his own family. His cousin, Malik, once a respected general, grew to popular among the soldiers. The Sultan noticed. One evening, Malik was summoned to a feast. Wine flowed, music played, and laughter echoed through the halls. By dawn, Malik was gone. His name was never spoken again. Some said he had fled. Others believed his body turned to steam inside the oil pot. And still, the Sultan ruled. Cities remained quiet. Traders paid double. Even foreign kings sent gifts, hoping to avoid the Sultan's wrath. But one man refused to kneel, a warlord from the east. His name was Arslan, and he had no fear of boiling oil. Arslan was not like the others. He was young, bold, and carried the blood of mountain warriors in his veins. His father had been killed by Timur's armies, and his people had learned to survive with grit and fury. When news of Sultan Iskander's boiling pot reached Arslan's court, he didn't tremble. He laughed. "Let him boil the wheat," Arslan said. "I will send him his own fire." His messengers rode day and night to Samarkand, carrying a gift wrapped in silk. When the Sultan unrolled it, he found a roasted sheep's head inside, a sign of defiance. Attached was a letter in bold script, "Come taste real heat in my land." The court went silent. Even the musicians stopped playing. The Sultan read the letter twice. Then, without a word, he tore it and ordered his generals to prepare for war. It wasn't just about revenge. Iskander had never been mocked like this before. And now, the world was watching. The army that marched east was one of the largest the Sultan had ever raised. Thousands of soldiers on horseback, camels loaded with supplies, and fire wagons carrying barrels of oil and mobile cauldrons. Yes, the Sultan took his pot with him, as if it were a sacred weapon. The journey was harsh. They crossed deserts, climbed rocky trails, and battled fierce winds. But Iskander was determined. He wanted Arslan's head boiled, served, and displayed. When the two armies finally met near the banks of the Sir Darya River, the air was thick with dust and tension. Arslan's men stood firm. They wore rough armor and carried handmade spears, but their eyes burned with fire. The Sultan rode to the front, dressed in black silk, his golden crown shining in the sun. He raised his hand, and the drums began to beat. Behind him, the soldiers lit the fire under the traveling cauldron. The message was clear: surrender or be boiled alive. But Arslan stepped forward. He spat on the ground and shouted, "Let your oil taste the blood of your own." His archers raised their bows. The sky turned dark with arrows. The battle began. Swords clashed, horses screamed, and blood soaked the earth. Iskander's soldiers were trained and deadly, but Arslan's warriors fought like demons. They knew the land, the hills, the rivers, and they had one advantage the Sultan did not: unity. By nightfall, the Sultan's army had lost a third of its men. The mobile cauldron lay overturned, its contents spilled into the dust. But the Sultan would not retreat. He had one last plan, something even worse than boiling. The battlefield stank of death. Bodies lay scattered like broken dolls, and vultures circled above. But Sultan Iskander, though wounded and furious, refused to accept defeat. His pride was too great. He ordered a night assault, not on the army, but on the villages nearby. If Arslan would not kneel, his people would suffer instead. Under the cover of darkness, the Sultan's men moved like shadows. They burned homes, slaughtered livestock, and dragged families from their beds. The screams pierced the cold night. Fires lit the horizon as entire villages were turned to ash. But Iskander didn't stop there. He had his men dig a pit, wide, deep, and cruel. Into it, they poured oil, pitch, and animal fat. They built a massive fire beneath it and waited for the oil to boil. Then came the prisoners. Dozens of men, tied and beaten, were lined up. Iskander stood above them, his robe stained with blood and dust, and spoke only once. "This is your warlord's legacy." One by one, the men were thrown in. The villagers were forced to watch. Mothers screamed, children cried, some fainted, others clawed at the earth, begging for mercy. But there was none. Arslan arrived too late. He saw the smoke first, then the ruins, then the pit. But what broke him was the silence. His people didn't run. They didn't curse. They only stared, hollow, empty, broken. Arslan fell to his knees, his sword dropping beside him. His fury had brought this. He rode back to his camp and called his elders. His generals advised him to attack again, to kill the Sultan with his own hands. But the elders, the old warriors with gray beards and haunted eyes, warned him, "If you fight this monster with fire, more fire will come." Arslan made a decision. At dawn, he rode alone to the Sultan's camp, unarmed. The guards raised their spears, but the Sultan ordered them to let him through. Arslan entered the tent, stood tall, and said, "You win. Let my people live." The Sultan smiled, a thin, cruel smile. "You kneel." Then Arslan lowered his head, not out of fear, but to save what remained. Iskander spared the villages, but Arslan was not freed. The Sultan had one final show planned. He ordered a platform built in the middle of the camp. On it, he placed the cauldron, freshly cleaned, newly polished. The fire roared beneath it. He invited every soldier, every merchant, every slave to watch. This time, there would be no screams, for Arslan stood calmly. As the chains tightened, Arslan didn't beg. He didn't cry. As the heat rose and the metal hissed beneath him, he stared into the flames without blinking. The soldiers around the platform murmured. Some had fought him just days ago. Others had lost friends to his blade. But none could deny the courage in his eyes. The Sultan sat nearby on a raised throne, shaded by silk, fanned by slaves. He watched closely, waiting for the moment Arslan would scream. But Arslan never did. Even as the guards lifted him above the cauldron, even as the smoke curled into his face, he remained silent. The fire cracked, the pot bubbled, the chains creaked under his weight, but Arslan stood tall. At the last moment, he turned his head and looked straight at Sultan Iskander. And then, with a single motion, he jumped. The silence that followed was deeper than any scream. No drumbeat, no cheer, just the sound of boiling oil and one final hiss. Iskander leaned forward, trying to feel satisfaction, but it didn't come. Arslan had taken that from him. By choosing death on his own terms, he had stolen the Sultan's victory. That night, something shifted in the camp. The soldiers drank, but not in celebration. The fire burned, but it felt colder. Even the sky, once clear, filled with dark clouds. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen. A trusted general vanished from his tent. A merchant caravan from Persia turned back halfway, claiming the roads felt cursed. Some said they saw Arslan's ghost in the hills, watching the campfires. The Sultan ignored the whispers. He told his men to tighten control. More guards, more fear. But fear, once a weapon, was turning against him. His own people began to distance themselves. Advisors stopped making eye contact. Servants quit without notice. Some fled in the night. The cauldron remained in the courtyard, polished and ready. But now, no one wanted to go near it. Even the guards took longer paths to avoid its shadow. One evening, a soldier refused to carry out an order to arrest a boy accused of stealing bread. He simply shook his head and said, "Enough for that." He was thrown into the pot. But something had changed. This time, the crowd didn't look away. They didn't cheer. They didn't flinch. They watched, not out of respect, not out of fear, but out of hate. And in that silent stare, Iskander saw something he had never felt before: doubt. Sultan Iskander could feel it. The silence that once signaled obedience now carried something different: resentment. Even his most loyal guards no longer spoke freely. Their salutes were stiff. Their eyes shifted away. He still ruled, yes, but the fear that once kept his kingdom quiet was beginning to rot from the inside. He ordered feasts. No one smiled. He paraded his war trophies. No one clapped. He raised taxes to fund a new palace. The merchants paid, but their faces were stone. Then came the dream. One night, as the wind howled through the palace walls, the Sultan woke in a cold sweat. He had dreamed of the cauldron, but this time, he was inside it. Arslan stood above him, smiling not cruelly, but calmly as the fire grew hotter. The dream repeated for nights. He stopped sleeping, and so, the Sultan did what he always did. He demanded control. He doubled patrols. He sent spies into every district. He demanded reports from governors, arrests of troublemakers, and public punishments for even the smallest insult. But the more he tightened his grip, the more cracks appeared. In the southern provinces, a small town refused to send taxes. When soldiers were dispatched, they found the gates closed and the streets armed. Iskander ordered a siege. It lasted 3 days. On the 4th, the soldiers entered the town. But there were no people, only one message, carved into the stone gate: "We boiled long enough." That night, a fire broke out near the palace kitchens. It spread quickly, burning stables, storage rooms, even part of the royal garden. The Sultan raged, ordering executions of any servant who had been on duty. Yet nothing stopped the unrest. Soon, messages began to appear on city walls, written in charcoal or scratched into stone. And the pot, boiling: Iskander, justices, coming. The Sultan was losing his grip, but he still had one plan. He would hold a great festival, not for war, not for punishment, but for peace. He declared it across the empire, a celebration of strength, unity, and glory. Foreign guests were invited. Gold poured into the streets. Banners flew from every tower. But beneath the silk and wine, the fear remained. The cauldron was still there, now placed at the center of the festival grounds. The fire was unlit, but its presence cast a shadow over every plate of food, every drumbeat, every toast. People laughed, but it was hollow. And among the crowd, unnoticed by the guards, a group of men and women stood in silence, waiting. They were not nobles, they were not generals, but they had watched their fathers, brothers, sisters, lovers, all vanish into the Sultan's oil. And now, they had returned, not with swords, not with armies, but with fire of their own. As the festival reached its peak, the city of Samarkand shimmered with lights. Drums pounded, dancers spun, and the Sultan sat high above the crowd, cloaked in gold, his crown gleaming. Foreign envoys raised their cups, pretending joy, but none missed the dark shape in the middle of the square. The cauldron. It stood silent, cold, yet heavier than any monument. Its shadow stretched farther than the torches could hide. The group that had gathered to end Iskander's reign moved quietly. They were servants, blacksmiths, widows, even former soldiers who had once lit the fire beneath that same pot. They carried no banners, no flags, only flasks of oil, strips of cloth, and a plan. At the edge of the crowd, a young girl passed a dancer of flour. Inside its stem was a sparkstone. A boy sold pastries to a noble, one of them filled with pitch. A blind man hummed a tune that wasn't a tune at all, but a signal. Then, just as the Sultan raised his goblet to speak, the first fire lit. Not beneath the pot, but behind it. A stall burst into flames. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the square turned into a storm of smoke and screams. People ran in all directions. Drums fell silent. Guards shouted, swords drawn. The Sultan rose from his throne, confused, furious. "Find them," he yelled. But it was too late. The cauldron, heavy with years of cruelty, began to glow. The fire was not his this time. It was theirs. From every side, the crowd closed in, not with weapons, but with fury. They threw ropes around the pot, pulled it down, tipped it on its side. The metal screamed as it hit the ground, splashing old oil across the stones. Then came the final blow. From the shadows, one man stepped forward, gray-haired, thin, but steady. He once served in the Sultan's army. He had watched his son die in that very pot. He said nothing, just struck a torch to the oil on the ground. Flames shot high. The cauldron was no more. Sultan Iskander tried to flee. His guards protected him, forming a wall. But the people were no longer afraid. Stones flew. Arrows whistled. Even the foreign guests began to slip away, not wanting to be caught in history's revenge. By morning, the palace gates were shut. The Sultan remained inside, surrounded by silence. But the city had already changed. Walls once marked by fear now carried messages of hope. The streets smelled of smoke, not from punishment, but from a different kind of fire, one that had burned the chains. And still, the people waited, because the Sultan still breathed, and there was one debt left to pay. The palace that had once echoed with commands and marching boots now stood like a tomb. The torches in the halls flickered low. Servants had vanished, even the guards, once loyal to death, now looked at each other with hesitation. Outside the gates, the streets were filled with thousands, not rioting, not shouting, just watching, waiting. Inside, Sultan Iskander paced. His robes were soaked with sweat, his crown discarded on the floor. The fire he once controlled had turned against him. The pot, his symbol of power, was gone, melted and twisted in the square. All that remained was the memory of what it had done. And now, the people wanted him. He tried sending out a message, a promise of reform, of peace, of mercy. But no rider returned. He ordered the guards to open the gates and speak to the crowd. No one moved. One of his commanders, a man who had fought by his side for 15 years, finally stepped forward. "My Sultan," he said quietly, "it is over." The Sultan's hand trembled. "They will tear me apart." The commander said nothing. Iskander sat down on the cold marble floor, staring at the doors. He thought of Yusuf, the noble who had watched his sons boil. He remembered Arslan's steady gaze before he leapt into the pot. He remembered the faces, the hundreds who had died not by sword, but by fire. He had ruled with fear. Now he was ruled by it. That night, he made a final decision. As the moon rose high above Samarkand, casting pale light over the ruined square, the palace gates opened. No army marched out. No banners flew. Instead, a small car rolled forward. Inside it sat Sultan Iskander, alone, hands bound, head lowered. The crowd parted, silent as snow. Some stared with hate, others with disbelief. This was the man who had boiled their brothers, their mothers, their children. Now, he looked like a ghost. The cart stopped at the center of the square, the very place where the cauldron once stood. A platform had been rebuilt, not for fire, but for judgment. The people didn't cheer. They didn't spit. They simply watched. One by one, the families of the dead were called forward. They stood before the fallen sultan and spoke their names, the names of the ones he had taken. He said nothing. By the time the last name was spoken, the sun had begun to rise. And when it did, the people made their choice. He would not be boiled. He would not be burned. He would be left alone in the ruins of his palace, stripped of title, food, and fire. A prisoner of silence. A king with nothing but ghosts. The days passed slowly for the fallen sultan. The palace, once filled with music, commands, and whispers of fear, now echoed only with wind and emptiness. The grand halls were silent. The throne room was cold. The golden banners had been torn down. Their fabric used to clothe the poor. Sultan Iskander, once the most feared man in Central Asia, now sat alone on a cracked marble bench, wrapped in a tattered wool cloak. No guards remained. No servants came. His meals, small bowls of barley and stale bread, were left outside the gates by children who didn't dare enter. They had heard too many stories of what he had done, and yet the city did not forget him. Every year on the day the cauldron fell, the people gathered in the square, not to celebrate, but to remember. They lit candles for the dead, laid flowers for the lost, and told stories to their children, not of revenge, but of courage, of Arslan, of Mariam, of the faceless hundreds who had once vanished into boiling oil. For the rest of his days, Iskander lived in the ruins of the world he created. He was not killed. He was not tortured. He was simply left to exist with the weight of every scream, every fire, every pair of eyes that once looked up at him in horror. He became the ghost of his own empire. Sometimes, passersby claimed they saw him standing at the broken balcony, staring at the square where his pot once smoked, his back hunched, his eyes hollow, his mouth never moving. Other times, they said they heard him talking to someone, though no one else was there. Was it guilt? Madness? Or had the spirits of his victims finally come to claim him? No one knows for sure. Only that one winter, the food was left at the gate, untouched. The children waited. Then, after 3 days, they found the door open. Inside, Sultan Iskander lay still, wrapped in his cloak, beneath a tattered royal banner. His face was pale, his eyes were closed, and in his hand, clenched tightly even in death, was the golden ring of Arslan. He died not as a king, nor as a monster, but as a man, alone, forgotten, and buried under the ashes of his own cruelty. History never boiled him. It remembered him. And for those who wish to uncover more forgotten truths, more brutal empires, and the dark corners of history that few dare to tell, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and click the notification bell for more stories the time tried to erase.